First of all, I have to declare some conflict of interest. For the last 2 years, I share my working time between the Annecy General Hospital with Dominique Savary and with Air Liquide Medical System, a French company working on ventilation, because I designed some new solution for ventilation during cardiopulmonary resuscitation, so directly in conflict of interest with my presentation. I have also a relationship with Vigon, Schiller, and other manufacturers, and I thank all these manufacturers to help in this research. I will introduce ventilation, but by this slide, showing something very archaic, very medieval, which is bag ventilation, but this is the use worldwide. And I think that the only reason to keep this system would be that simplicity may be the guarantee of its efficacy, easy to use, and simplicity. But I am not sure on that. And I think that several harmful effects are associated with this apparent very simple approach. First of all, bag ventilation may affect circulation just by interruption of chest compression. And we discussed that, as you know, is very, very important to limit as much as possible chest compression interruption. The second specific issue associated with bag ventilation is the risk of hyperventilation. And there is several observational studies showing that we perform too much ventilation with the bag. And the risk of too much ventilation with the bag is to directly affect, to directly impair circulation. Of course, ventilation is absolutely needed, but too much ventilation is risky, and the most demonstration of that is the Lazarus phenomenon, which describes some patients during cardiopulmonary resuscitation who resume circulation immediately after stopping ventilation. This is the demonstration that too much ventilation may impair and stop circulation. And this is very important to keep that in mind to better practice bag ventilation. And I know that there is some colleagues working on specific system to help users to use the bag while taking into account the risk of ventilation. So 3 years ago, with my colleague Laurent Brochard, we decided to design a specific lung model to try to better understand the relationship between circulation and ventilation, and also with the idea to revisit ventilation in order to limit the harmful effect, and maybe to revisit ventilation to help or to improve circulation. And I will show you some data on that, on this recent paper that we published on Journal Applied Physiology. This is the setup that we made in Geneva. You recognize Georges Boussignac and Ricardo and Essam. This is a system that we use to try to better understand the approach that we will discuss. The concept is very far from physiology. I confess that. But I think that this concept is very important to understand for the clinical practice and also to understand physiology and to think about new device for cardiopulmonary resuscitation. It's very easy to understand. Let's suppose that you perform too much ventilation with the bag. The thorax will go up above the FRC. During compression, you will generate some circulation by the increase in intrathoracic pressure. But what happened during decompression? Because the system is above FRC, during decompression, the system will go back with positive pressure, thus impairing the venous return. So, too much ventilation is not good for this reason. In the opposite, let's suppose a strong chest compression with no interruption, like we can observe with an automatic device, for instance. And let's suppose you don't have positive pressure at the airway opening. The risk is to stress the lungs to go far below the FRC. And far below the FRC, you will impair the lungs. You will promote edema. You will promote blood into the aspiration. And the low lung volume will also probably induce some airway collapse and some negative pressure that could not be good for venous return, and we will discuss that. So based on this lung model, we had some results showing that in red, this is a positive pressure during compression, intrathoracic pressure. In blue, this is the negative pressure on the lung model, without ventilation, with the bag, and with the system developed by Georges Boussignac with a continuous flow insufflation at 5 and 10 centimeters of water. And we recorded the variation in intrathoracic pressure, and you can see that even with 5 or 10 centimeters of water in this model, again, far from physiology, the positive pressure is good, but the negative pressure required for venous return is still present. Just because you are still below the FRC during the compression, then during decompression, you generate by the recoil some negative pressure that promotes venous return, even with positive pressure. What we observe is that the loss in lung volume during chest compression is very huge. Without ventilation, it's minus 500 milliliters, and with positive pressure, you limit a little bit the loss in lung volume below the FRC, but again, because you're still below the FRC, you still have negative pressure, so an effective circulation. Okay, lung model far from physiology. Interestingly, thanks to my team in Annecy and Dominique Savary, we have some clinical observation published in this paper. This is a recording in out-hospital cardiac arrest patient under mechanical chest compression. You can see the flow, the airway pressure change due to the chest compression, and this is the lung volume that we reconstitute below the red line, which represents the FRC. You can see that in this patient, the reduction in lung volume below the FRC reached minus 600 milliliters, which is a huge reduction in lung volume, and again, a maximal stress for the lungs that for sure will promote edema. So this is a very interesting first observation, because before it was never quantified, this reduction in lung volume. And the price to pay of this reduction in lung volume is the closing of the airways during the cardiopulmonary resuscitation. Look at this patient under chest compression, mechanical chest compression. You have the flow, and this is the flow done by the ventilator, and this is the flow entering into the thorax during decompression. You can see that in this example, the PEEP level was 3, and then the PEEP level was 0. I don't know why. The physician decided that. You can see that reducing the PEEP to 0 immediately resulted in a flow limitation entering into the thorax, meaning that no ventilation was present in these settings. And you can see that the pressure measured at the airway opening was no longer transmitted, indicated that chest compression pressure was no longer transmitted to the ventilator, indicating airway collapse. So this is the first time that we demonstrate the airway collapse occurring during chest compression during cardiopulmonary resuscitation. Interestingly, we observe by recording the untitled CO2 in several patients, we observe 2 different patterns of untitled CO2. This is the pattern recording in one patient, in the other patient, and this is recording on a bench test in Toronto with my colleague Laurent Brochard and Domenico Graccio. And we observe here with PEEP 0 the airway occlusion with no ventilation, no transmission of the airway pressure, indicating the collapse, and this pattern in blue of end-tidal CO2 that looks like this pattern. Look at what happens if you increase the PEEP from 0 to 5 centimeters of water. The increase in PEEP level will resume the airway collapse, and then there is some ventilation. You can see the flow. There is airway pressure transmission, and then the end-tidal CO2 change immediately with this oscillation. And we think with Laurent Brochard team group in Toronto that the pattern of end-tidal CO2 associated by the change in airway pressure during chest compression may indicate the opening or closing on airway pressure. That is very important for CO2 elimination, but also for oxygenation, because if the airway are closed, oxygenation is clearly affected and compromised. So we have the opportunity to work with our colleagues in Quebec and Montreal on a cadavers model, a Thiel cadavers model, to reproduce cardiopulmonary resuscitation. And this is a very recent result we had with PEEP and without PEEP. This is the intrathoracic pressure change. We measure the esophageal and pleural pressure, which is very important because this is a pressure important for circulation. This is this variation that promotes circulation. And this is the airway pressure measured on the ventilator at the airway opening. Look at what happened when you stop PEEP. You close the airway, but the intrathoracic pressure is not significantly affected by a level of PEEP reaching 8 or 10 centimeters of water, indicating that without PEEP, the airway are collapsed, oxygenation probably compromised, and CO2 elimination also compromised. So based on all these observations, we designed with the help of Air Liquide Medical System of my friend Marceau Rigolo, who is an engineer, a mode of ventilation specifically designed for cardiopulmonary resuscitation. The name is cardiopulmonary ventilation. This is on a turbine ventilator. And this system works in pressure. It permits continuous chest compression with no interruption. And there is some intellectual properties, some pattern that permit to maintain zero airway pressure at the airway opening during decompression, to respect venous return, while the system increases the pressure transmitted to the circulation during chest compression. The system allows monitoring of frequency of chest compression, the PP variation, and end-tidal CO2. And we start some clinical study with this approach with Dominique Savary in Annecy. So my conclusion, I think that it's very important to keep in mind that bag mask ventilation is not so easy. It's complex and potentially harmful for circulation, and we have to think about new systems to help a better approach for bag mask ventilation. During cardiopulmonary resuscitation, lung volume are significantly reduced below the FRC. And the price to pay of that is that this lung volume reduction promotes airway collapse that may affect CO2 elimination, but also oxygenation. PEEP, and I know that it's not easy to understand. You understand that my presentation is on physiological observation. I have no strong clinical data to say that. But we think strongly that PEEP may limit airway collapse without impairing intrathoracic pressure change. We measure that on cadavers, and we have now some very strong data showing that above until 8 centimeters of water, there is no risk to impair circulation with PEEP. Last, I think that there is different solution, but I think that for ventilation, we have to privilege continuous chest compression, and for that, there is a big card invented by Georges Boussignac, the mode that we developed, cardiopulmonary ventilation, that may replace the bag mask ventilation to limit the adverse effect of ventilation, and maybe to improve oxygenation, CO2 elimination, and maybe to improve circulation. Thank you so much for your attention.